Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, staring at a horizon that had just filled with the impossible. Emerging from a rain squall came the silhouettes of Japanese warships. Not the light cruisers or destroyers his radar had detected, but battleships. 4 of them, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, bristling with 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles. Behind those battleships came 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers, 23 Japanese warships bearing down on 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The ships of Taffy III, tasked with providing air support for the Lady landings, not fighting the largest surface engagement of the Pacific War. What Commander Evans didn't know yet was that he was about to order his 2,050-ton Fletcher-class destroyer to charge directly at battleships that displaced 32,000 to 72,000 tons. Ships so massive that Johnston's entire hull could fit on one of Yamato's forward decks. He didn't know that his decision in the next 60 seconds would save thousands of American lives, delay the Japanese fleet long enough for the carriers to escape, and earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously. What he did know was captured in the 5 words he spoke to his crew over the intercom, words that would define one of history's most audacious naval attacks: prepare to attack major portion of Japanese fleet. The story of USS Johnston's last battle is a story about courage so extreme it approaches madness, tactical brilliance born from desperation, and a crew that followed their captain into an impossible fight because they trusted him completely. It's a story that ended 18,000 feet beneath the Philippine Sea, where Johnston's wreck was discovered in 2019, the deepest shipwreck ever located, testament to the violence of her final moments. The situation, when the battle plan collapsed. The battle off Samar was never supposed to happen. The entire American strategy at Leyte Gulf was predicated on Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet intercepting and destroying any Japanese naval forces approaching the invasion beaches. The escort carriers of Taffy III, 6 small, slow, lightly armed ships designed to provide air support, were never intended to face surface combat. But Admiral Halsey had taken the bait. Japanese carriers approaching from the north had lured his powerful fleet away from the landing beaches, leaving only the escort carrier groups to guard the vulnerable troop transports and supply ships at Leyte. This was exactly what Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita had hoped for when he led the center force through San Bernardino Strait during the night of October 24th to 25th. Kurita's force was formidable and represented Japan's last gamble in the Philippines campaign. At its core was Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded and carrying 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed as much as a small car and could penetrate 16 inches of armor at 20 miles. Accompanying Yamato was her sister ship Nagato, along with battleships Kongo and Haruna. 6 heavy cruisers, Haguro, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Toni, provided additional firepower. 11 destroyers screened the formation. Together they mounted over 100 major caliber guns and dozens of torpedo tubes. Against this armada stood Taffy III, 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kowloon Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. The escort carriers were converted merchant hulls, slow, maximum speed 18 knots, thin-skinned, and armed only with a single 5-inch gun. They carried aircraft, but those aircraft were loaded with bombs and rockets for ground support missions, not armor-piercing ordnance suitable for attacking ships. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were the only real warships in Taffy III, but they were designed for escort duty and anti-submarine warfare, not surface combat against battleships. Each destroyer mounted 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes, capable weapons against enemy destroyers or cruisers, but laughably inadequate against battleships, with armor measured in feet rather than inches. When Kurita's force appeared on the horizon at 6:45 a.m., The tactical situation was simple and catastrophic. The Japanese could steam at 25 to 30 knots. The escort carriers could make 18 knots maximum. The Japanese had the speed to overtake the carriers within an hour. They had the firepower to destroy every ship in Taffy 3 with ease. And they had surprise. Taffy 3 had no warning the center force had come through San Bernardino Strait because Halsey's departure had left that approach unguarded and unmonitored. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, immediately recognized the disaster. His carriers couldn't outrun the Japanese. His aircraft weren't armed for anti-ship attacks. His escorts were absurdly outgunned. By every rational calculation, Taffy 3 should be annihilated within an hour, and the Japanese fleet would then fall upon the defenseless transports and supply ships at Leyte, potentially destroying the entire invasion force. Sprague ordered the carriers to flee east at maximum speed, making smoke to obscure Japanese targeting. He ordered his escorts to make smoke and prepare for torpedo attacks, and then he did the only thing he could do. He prayed for a miracle while his ships fought for time. The miracle would come from destroyers and destroyer escorts willing to charge battleships, trading their lives for minutes that might allow the carriers to escape. And the first ship to make that impossible charge was USS Johnston, commanded by a half-Cherokee Native American from Oklahoma, who had told his crew on the day the ship commissioned, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now." The man, Commander Ernest Evans. Ernest Edwin. Evans was born on August 13, 1908 in Pawnee, Oklahoma. His mother was part Cherokee. His father was of European descent. Evans grew up in Oklahoma during an era when Native Americans faced systematic discrimination, but he possessed determination and intelligence that would carry him far beyond the limitations society tried to impose. Evans graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1931. Commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Navy at a time when Native American officers were extremely rare in the service. He served on various ships throughout the 1930s, gaining reputation as an aggressive, competent officer who led from the front and took care of his men. By the time USS Johnston commissioned on October 27, 1943, Evans was 35 years old and had been selected to command the new Fletcher-class destroyer. At the commissioning ceremony, Evans addressed his crew with words that revealed both his combat philosophy and his character. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now. The Johnston will make torpedo runs when others are making smoke. We will go in and do battle against the heaviest ships in the Japanese Navy, and we will emerge victorious." It was an extraordinary statement, a destroyer captain declaring he would seek out the most dangerous combat possible. Many officers made rousing speeches at commissioning ceremonies. Few meant them with the literal intensity that Evans demonstrated. Evans's leadership style was demanding but fair. He trained his crew relentlessly, running drill after drill until every action became instinctive. He emphasized damage control, gunnery accuracy, and torpedo tactics. He also took exceptional care of his men, ensuring they received proper food, rest, and medical attention. The crew respected him not just for his competence, but for the obvious fact that he genuinely cared about their welfare. Johnston participated in several operations in 1944, including the invasion of the Marshall Islands and various escort missions. The ship performed well, demonstrating the effectiveness of Evans's training, but nothing in Johnston's previous experience would prepare the crew for what they would face off Samar on October 25, 1944. The decision: all engines ahead flank, commence firing. At 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes after radar detected the Japanese force, and while Admiral Sprague was still assessing the situation, Commander Evans made his decision without waiting for orders. All engines ahead flank, commence firing. Johnston's 4 boilers were already producing maximum steam. The ship's 2 Curtiss turbines roared to life, driving the twin screws to push Johnston's 2,050 tons through the water at over 35 knots. The destroyer heeled hard to port as Evans turned directly toward the Japanese formation, charging alone toward an enemy fleet that outweighed his entire ship by ratios of 15 to 1 or even 35 to 1. The gun crews needed no additional orders. They had trained for this. Johnston's 5.5-inch 38 caliber guns opened fire at maximum range, approximately 18,000 yards. The guns could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute, sending 55-pound shells toward targets still beyond visual range, relying on radar fire control to guide the salvos. Evans' plan was audacious to the point of appearing suicidal, but it was tactically sound given the impossible situation. Johnston would charge the Japanese formation at maximum speed while firing continuously, creating maximum confusion and forcing the Japanese to respond to the threat. More importantly, Johnston would close to torpedo range and launch her 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, weapons far more potent than her guns against armored warships. The Mark 15 torpedo carried an 825-pound Torpex warhead and had a range of 6,000 yards at high speed or 15,000 yards at lower speeds. Against battleship armor, a single torpedo hit might not be fatal, but it would cause flooding, force damage control responses, and potentially slow the target enough to disrupt the Japanese pursuit of the carriers. But to launch torpedoes effectively, Johnston had to close to within 10,000 yards or less, close enough that Japanese heavy guns could engage with devastating accuracy. Evans was betting that his speed, aggressive maneuvering, and the confusion caused by his unexpected charge would allow Johnston to reach launch range before being destroyed. The Japanese response was initially confused. Kurita's staff officers reported a destroyer charging the formation, which made no tactical sense. Single destroyers don't charge battleship formations. It had to be a mistake, or perhaps the American ship was trying to lay smoke for the carriers. Precious seconds passed while Japanese commanders tried to understand what they were seeing. Then Johnston's shells began landing around the heavy cruiser Kumano. The shells couldn't penetrate the cruiser's armor at this range, but they demonstrated that the American destroyer was engaging aggressively, not retreating. Japanese doctrine emphasized annihilating enemy forces completely, so several ships shifted fire toward Johnston, attempting to destroy the impudent destroyer before it could close further. Johnston jinked and wove through the water at 35 knots, Evans using every bit of his ship's maneuverability to throw off Japanese ranging. Shells landed around Johnston, massive geysers of water erupting as 14-inch and 16-inch shells missed by dozens or hundreds of yards. The Japanese guns were designed for long-range engagements against large, relatively slow targets like battleships. Tracking a destroyer at high speed and extreme range while that destroyer maneuvered violently was extraordinarily difficult. But Johnston couldn't dodge forever. At 7:10 a.m., after charging for 12 minutes and closing to approximately 10,000 yards, Evans ordered fire torpedoes. Johnston's torpedo tubes swiveled to firing position. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes launched in rapid succession, their compressed air engines driving them through the water at 45 knots toward the Japanese formation. Evans immediately ordered hard rudder, turning Johnston away from the enemy fleet to disengage before the Japanese could destroy his ship at point-blank range. The torpedoes ran true, spreading across a wide arc to maximize chances of hitting the Japanese ships. Several torpedoes struck home. The exact number and targets remained disputed, but at minimum one torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing the cruiser to withdraw from battle, reducing Japanese heavy cruiser strength by 1/6. More importantly, Johnston's aggressive charge and torpedo attack forced the entire Japanese formation to maneuver, breaking their coordinated advance on the carriers. Individual ships took evasive action, turned away from the torpedo tracks, and shifted their formations to avoid the threat. The perfect coordination Kurita needed to efficiently pursue and destroy the carriers dissolved into individual ship actions. Johnston had bought the carriers 10 to 15 minutes of time through sheer audacity, but the reprieve was temporary, and Johnston's own situation was about to become catastrophic. The punishment: when giants fight back. At 7:15 a.m., as Johnston completed her turn away from the Japanese formation, 3 14-inch shells from Battleship Congo struck the destroyer in rapid succession. The first shell hit Johnston's aft engine room, penetrating the thin deck armor and exploding inside the compartment. The explosion killed every man in the engine room instantly, shattered one of the ship's 2 main turbines, and severed steam lines throughout the aft section. Johnston's speed immediately dropped from 35 knots to less than 20 as half. Her propulsion system was destroyed. The second shell hit the bridge area, killing or wounding several officers and destroying much of the ship's fire control equipment. Commander Evans was wounded by shrapnel, losing 2 fingers on his left hand. The ship's executive officer was killed. The gunnery officer was seriously wounded. In seconds, Johnston's command structure was devastated. The third shell hit farther aft, causing additional casualties and starting fires throughout the ship's superstructure. Johnston was grievously wounded, but not dead. The forward engine room remained intact, providing power to 1 screw. The forward 3-gun mounts still functioned. The bridge, though damaged, still had some operational capability. And Commander Evans, though wounded and having lost several fingers, remained conscious and in command. Evans assessed the damage with the cold calculation of a commander who knew his ship was dying, but still had work to do. Johnston couldn't make flank speed anymore. Her fire control was degraded, but she could still fight, and the carriers still needed time to escape. All guns commence firing. Local control, Evans ordered. With the main fire control damaged, each gun mount would aim and fire independently using local directors and manual calculation. It was less accurate than centralized fire control, but it was all Johnston had left. The gunners responded immediately. Johnston's 3 functioning 5-inch guns continued firing at Japanese cruisers that were now pursuing the carriers. The shells couldn't penetrate cruiser armor, but they could damage radar arrays, destroy exposed equipment, and kill personnel on deck. Every hit, however minor, degraded Japanese combat efficiency and bought the carriers more seconds. Damage control parties fought the fires, spreading through Johnston's superstructure. With half the ship's steam power lost, electrical power was compromised throughout the vessel. Emergency lighting systems activated. Portable pumps were deployed to fight flooding in compartments breached by shell hits. Wounded were carried to the mess deck, which had been converted to an emergency aid station. The ship was a chaos of smoke, fire, blood, and desperate work. Men who had trained for this moment found themselves living through scenarios that training could never fully prepare them for, dealing with shattered compartments, severed limbs, raging fires, and the knowledge that their ship was mortally wounded, but still fighting. At 7:30 a.m., Admiral Sprague's voice crackled over the radio. "Small boys, attack." It was the order for destroyers and destroyer escorts to make torpedo runs against the Japanese fleet. The same desperate tactic Johnston had already executed 15 minutes earlier without waiting for orders. USS Howell and USS Hirman, Johnston's sister destroyers, immediately turned toward the Japanese formation and began their own suicide charges. The 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, followed suit, despite being smaller, slower, and even more lightly armed than the destroyers. Commander Evans watched his fellow destroyers and escorts charging toward the Japanese fleet and made another decision that sealed Johnston's fate. His ship was crippled, barely capable of 17 knots, with degraded fire control and diminished combat capability. By any rational calculation, Johnston should withdraw from the battle, attempt to save what remained of the crew, and preserve the ship if possible. Instead, Evans ordered Johnston to join the attack. The impossible battle, destroyer versus battleship. What followed over the next 2 hours was naval combat so chaotic, so desperate, and so extraordinary that many historians consider it the finest hour of the U.S. Navy's surface warfare tradition. Johnston, barely able to make 17 knots with half her propulsion destroyed, positioned herself to engage Japanese heavy cruisers attempting to flank the carriers. Evans identified cruiser Haguro as a threat and ordered all guns to engage. Johnston's 3 functioning 5-inch mounts fired as rapidly as crews could load, sending 55-pound shells toward a heavy cruiser that displaced 15,000 tons and mounted 10 8-inch guns. It was absurd. It was impossible. It worked. Johnston's fire was accurate despite the damaged fire control. Shells struck Haguro repeatedly, damaging her bridge and forcing the cruiser to turn away temporarily. Evans then shifted fire to cruiser Tone, which was attempting to position for torpedo attacks against the carriers. Again, Johnston's gunnery was effective enough to force the Japanese cruiser to maneuver defensively. The Japanese couldn't believe what they were seeing. A crippled destroyer, trailing smoke and clearly damaged, was engaging heavy cruisers at point-blank range with nothing but 5-inch guns. It was so tactically irrational that Japanese commanders initially assumed Johnston must be covering a major American counterattack, that this destroyer was the vanguard of a much larger force. No such force existed. There was only Johnston, her crew, and Commander Evans' absolute determination to keep fighting until the ship could no longer function. At 8:20 a.m., Johnston's lookout spotted heavy cruiser Chikuma approaching from a different angle, attempting to get into position to shell the carriers. Evans immediately turned Johnston toward this new threat, opening fire with all functioning guns. The range closed to 7,000 yards, point-blank range for naval combat where even 5-inch shells could cause significant damage to unarmored portions of cruisers. Johnston's gunners poured fire into Chikuma, hitting the cruiser's bridge and upper works repeatedly. The Japanese cruiser returned fire with her 8-inch main battery, but Johnston's violent maneuvering made targeting difficult. For nearly 20 minutes, this impossible duel continued, destroyer against heavy cruiser, fighting at ranges where both ships could inflict damage. Chikuma eventually broke off the engagement, turning away from the carriers she had been pursuing. Whether Johnston's fire had caused sufficient damage to force this decision or whether the cruiser's captain simply decided that engaging a suicidally aggressive destroyer wasn't worth the risk remains unclear. What's certain is that Johnston had once again bought the carrier's precious time. But Johnston's luck was running out. Multiple Japanese ships were now focusing fire on the destroyer. At 9:10 a.m., a combination of hits from several ships struck Johnston simultaneously. The already damaged bridge area was hit again, destroying what remained of the fire control systems. The forward stack was destroyed. Additional hits below the waterline caused catastrophic flooding in multiple compartments. Johnston's speed dropped to less than 10 knots. The ship was listing heavily to port. Fires were burning out of control in several compartments. The number of casualties had risen dramatically. Dozens of men were dead or seriously wounded. The ship was clearly dying. Commander Evans, wounded multiple times by this point and barely able to stand, surveyed his shattered bridge. The tactical situation was clear. Johnston could no longer maneuver effectively. Her guns could still fire, but only under local control with degraded accuracy. The ship was sinking. It was only a question of when. Evans gave the order no captain ever wants to give: abandon ship. The final moments. Going down fighting. The order to abandon ship began the final phase of Johnston's battle, a phase that would prove just as heroic as the preceding combat. Damage control parties opened compartments that had been sealed to prevent flooding from spreading, allowing trapped personnel to escape. Life rafts were deployed. Men who could still walk helped wounded shipmates to rafting stations. In the midst of this organized evacuation, Johnston's guns continued firing. Some gun crews remained at their stations, firing until the mounts physically could no longer function. Japanese ships continued firing at Johnston even as the destroyer was clearly sinking. Shells hit the dying ship, causing additional casualties among men attempting to abandon ship. Some historians have criticized this as unnecessary, shooting at a ship that was clearly defeated and sinking. But the Japanese perspective was different. American destroyers had proven extraordinarily aggressive throughout this battle, and assuming a destroyer was finished until it actually disappeared beneath the waves was tactically prudent. At 9:45 a.m., approximately 3 hours after Johnston had first charged the Japanese fleet, the destroyer rolled onto her side. Commander Evans was last seen standing on the tilted deck near the bridge, declining to abandon ship. Several sailors reported that he waved them toward life rafts, ensuring his crew evacuated while he remained aboard. Johnston hung suspended for a moment, her hull fully exposed, damage visible across the entire length of the ship. Then she slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the deep waters of the Philippine Sea. Of Johnston's crew of 327 officers and men, only 141 survived. 186 were killed in action or died in the water after the ship sank. Commander Ernest Evans was among those killed. His body was never recovered. The survivors spent hours in the water, clinging to life rafts and debris, watching as the battle continued around them. Some Japanese ships passed close by the survivors. In several documented instances, Japanese sailors threw food and water to Americans in the water, a gesture of respect for courageous enemies, even in the midst of battle. The survivors were eventually rescued by American ships after the battle ended. They carried with them stories of courage that seemed almost impossible to believe, stories of their captain charging battleships, of gun crews firing until the mounts were physically destroyed, of damage control parties fighting fires and floods even as the ships sank beneath them. The aftermath, when audacity saved thousands. The battle off Samar ended with results that shocked both sides. Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force, had achieved complete tactical surprise and possessed overwhelming firepower superiority. By any rational assessment, he should have annihilated Taffy 3 within an hour and then fallen upon the defenseless transports at Leyte. Instead, Kurita withdrew after approximately 2.5 hours of combat. His force had sunk 1 escort carrier, Gambier Bay, 2 destroyers, Johnston and Howell, and 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts. But Kurita believed he was facing a much larger American force, that the destroyers' suicidal attacks indicated the presence of fleet carriers and possibly battleships just over the horizon. The aggressive attacks by Johnston and other escorts had created chaos in the Japanese formation. Individual ships had maneuvered independently to avoid torpedoes, losing tactical coordination. The aggressive American defense convinced Kurita that pursuing the carriers would expose his force to coordinated attacks from what he believed was a much larger American fleet. Kurita's decision to withdraw was one of the most controversial in naval history. He had the opportunity to potentially change the outcome of the Philippines campaign by destroying the invasion fleet's supplies and support. His withdrawal allowed the Leyte operation to proceed successfully, ultimately leading to the liberation of the Philippines and cutting Japan's access to oil from the Dutch East Indies, a strategic disaster from which Japan never recovered. The small boys of Taffy 3, the destroyers and destroyer escorts that charged battleships, had achieved a strategic victory through tactical audacity. Johnston alone had engaged battleships and heavy cruisers for over 3 hours, launching 10 torpedoes, firing over 200 5-inch shells, and forcing multiple Japanese ships to maneuver defensively or withdraw from action. The cost had been terrible. 186 of Johnston's 327 crew were dead, but their sacrifice had saved thousands of lives aboard the carriers, the invasion transports, and the support ships at Leyte. The battle off Samar demonstrated that courage, aggressive tactics, and willingness to accept casualties could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation read in part, "Outgunned and outmaneuvered by the enemy force, Commander Evans inspired his men to unwavering faith in their ship and in himself. His example led his crew to a valiant fight against overwhelming odds." The Discovery, 18,000 feet down. For 75 years, USS Johnston's final resting place remained unknown. The ship had sunk in water over 20,000 feet deep, far beyond the reach of conventional salvage or survey equipment. But in 2019, an expedition funded by Victor Vescovo, a former naval officer and deep-sea explorer, located Johnston's wreck using specialized deep-diving submersibles. The discovery was extraordinary for multiple reasons. At approximately 21,180 feet below the surface, Johnston is the deepest shipwreck ever located, deeper than the Titanic, deeper than any other known shipwreck. The depth itself speaks to the violence of Johnston's sinking. The ship plummeted over 4 miles through the water column before coming to rest on the abyssal plain. The wreck survey revealed remarkable details about Johnston's final battle. The ship is largely intact, sitting upright on the seafloor. The damage is catastrophic and clearly visible. The destroyed after engine room, the shattered bridge area, the missing sections of deck and superstructure. Multiple shell penetrations are evident throughout the hull. But what struck the exploration team most was the condition of the gun mounts. Several guns were still trained toward where the Japanese fleet had been when Johnston sank, frozen in their final firing positions. The gun crews had literally fought until the ship sank beneath them. The wreck site is now protected as a war grave. The 186 men who died with Johnston remain with their ship. 4 miles beneath the Philippine Sea, eternal guardians of one of history's most remarkable last stands. The legacy, what Johnston's sacrifice means. The story of USS Johnston transcends simple naval history. It represents fundamental truths about courage, leadership, and the capacity of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Commander Evans's decision to charge the Japanese fleet without orders, when rational calculations suggested retreat or at minimum waiting for coordinated action, demonstrates the kind of tactical initiative that training can encourage but never guarantee. Evans understood that the carriers needed time more than they needed coordination. Every minute Johnston could delay. The Japanese was a minute the carriers could use to escape. The crew's willingness to follow Evans into impossible combat demonstrates the power of leadership and trust. These were not professional warriors or elite special forces. They were average Americans, many barely out of their teens, serving on a destroyer in the Pacific. They followed Evans because he had trained them well, treated them fairly, and led by example. When he ordered them to charge battleships, they trusted his judgment and their own training enough to execute without hesitation. The tactical impact of Johnston's attack, forcing Japanese cruisers to withdraw, disrupting formations, creating chaos that led to Kurita's eventual decision to retreat, demonstrates that desperate situations sometimes require desperate tactics. By conventional doctrine, destroyers don't charge battleship formations, but conventional doctrine assumes normal circumstances. When circumstances are extraordinary, tactics must adapt. The sacrifice of Johnston and her sister ships also reveals uncomfortable truths about naval warfare. The 186 men who died aboard Johnston were not killed achieving a dramatic tactical victory. They died buying time. Their deaths purchased minutes that allowed carriers to escape and ultimately contributed to strategic victory. But those men died in a burning, sinking ship, many drowning or dying of wounds in the water. Modern naval warfare has changed dramatically since 1944. Guided missiles have replaced guns as primary weapons. Combat occurs at distances measured in miles rather than yards, but the fundamental principles Johnston demonstrated remain valid. Aggressive action can overcome superior firepower. Initiative matters more than waiting for orders, and courage can accomplish what firepower alone cannot. The destroyer that refused to run. On October the 25th, 1944, when Commander Ernest Evans saw battleships on the horizon, every tactical manual and every bit of conventional wisdom said a destroyer should retreat, make smoke, and call for support. Destroyers were not designed to fight battleships. The weight of metal a battleship could throw in a single salvo exceeded the total weight of Johnston's entire main battery. Evans didn't retreat. He charged. That decision, made in seconds, executed over 3 hours, concluded with his death and the deaths of 185 of his crew, saved thousands of American lives, and changed the outcome of the Philippines campaign. The Japanese fleet that should have destroyed the invasion force instead withdrew after facing resistance so fierce and so irrational that it convinced them they were facing a much larger American force. Johnston was a small ship, 2,050 tons, 300 to 76 feet long, crewed by 327 men. Most of those men were teenagers or in their early 20s. They were not elite special forces or career military professionals. They were average Americans who had trained well and trusted their captain. When their captain ordered them to charge battleships, they charged. When their captain ordered them to keep fighting despite catastrophic damage, they fought. When their ship was sinking beneath them and Japanese shells were still falling, they helped wounded shipmates to life rafts before saving themselves. This is not Hollywood fiction or propaganda mythology. This is what actually happened, documented by survivors, verified by official records, and confirmed by the wreck site 4 miles beneath the Philippine Sea where Johnston remains. Her guns still pointed toward where the Japanese fleet once steamed. The destroyer that charged battleships did not survive, but the thousands of men aboard the carriers Johnston protected did survive. The invasion of the Philippines succeeded. The strategic oil resources Japan desperately needed were denied, and the war moved one step closer to Allied victory. Commander Ernest Evans never received his Medal of Honor. He died with his ship. But 75 years later, when explorers found Johnston's wreck and saw those gun mounts still trained, toward the enemy, frozen in their final defiant positions, they understood what that medal recognized. Courage so complete it approaches the incomprehensible. Leadership so effective it inspired ordinary men to extraordinary achievement, and sacrifice so total it changed history. 4 miles beneath the Philippine Sea, in darkness and pressure that would crush unprotected humans instantly, USS Johnston rests where she fell. The ship is a war grave protected by treaty and respect. The 186 men who died with her remain aboard, serving still in memory and honor. They were the crew of the destroyer that charged battleships. They were the men who refused to run when running was the only rational choice. They were Americans who, when faced with impossible odds, made the impossible possible through pure courage and absolute determination. And they earned, through sacrifice and valor, their place among the greatest naval warriors in history.